Nexus repository as part of the requirements of this course. I've created a separate repository for our understanding, so you can access this. I'm on my GitHub, so you can come to my GitHub and you can access the project repository of Nexus Learning Repo. The Nexus Learning Repo just is almost an advanced version of the Maven Learning Repo, where some more configurations as far as Nexus is concerned. Now the repo is very basic. We still have the installation setup which we had for Maven. We've added now installation configurations for Nexus. So we have the Maven install. We have the Maven install README file. So this was the README file which we used to install Apache Maven on our Amazon Linux 2 instance. But now this is the shell script which has been customized to install Nexus on a given compute, specifically on EC2. So we are going to be running this shell script in our EC2 instance. Just a very quick one. It requires Apache, just a very quick one. It requires Java 11. Nexus requires Java 11 to be installed. So you do sudo yum install Java 11 correcto-y, and then you add a Nexus user. You add it to you add some form of password. You grant it, and then you add the Nexus. You create a Nexus user and add it to the sudoers file. And then after that, you download Nexus using wget command. You extract the Nexus package, and then you create a Nexus service. All of this is for us to create a Nexus service, and then you set and run Nexus as a user with Nexus configuration. This is some form of configuration which you have, and then you have to start the Nexus service using enable and start the Nexus service, and of course you can check the Nexus service. So you can equally search for the official documentation to install Nexus. So you can search for installation documentation for Nexus repository. So there'll be a lot of documentation which you can have. Here's a step-by-step guide, installation upgrades, installation methods. So you can pick up any of these. This is a step-by-step guide to installing Nexus Repository Manager by Geeks by Geeks. So this is, you see, it contains a set of commands, almost the same set of commands which we are going to be running in our own EC2 instance. So without necessarily doing this, I've customized all of this in this user data which we are going to be using. So this is the main installation guide, and then of course in this same repository we have our Java application code containing all our code files. The Java application code contains all our code files. Now if you come back to this Nexus repository, you get a lot more insight of Nexus. Basically, Apache Maven integrates with Nexus Repository Manager to host and manage artifacts. We established in a previous module that the moment you create artifacts, you store these artifacts. The artifacts might be a war.war or a .jar file. The moment you create this artifacts .war or .jar file, you want to store this artifact in our repository manager. So they say using Maven's distribution management configuration, artifacts, like I said, the artifacts can be a jar file or a WAR file. These artifacts can be deployed to a Nexus repository, and made accessible to other projects or teams. Now, once you create these artifacts and store in Nexus, you can have the artifacts stored in different versions in Nexus for use in your current project, or you can use the artifacts in different projects. Assuming you want to deploy these artifacts in a setup maybe with Ansible, you can reference these artifacts from your Nexus repository to perform the deployment. And for you to configure Nexus, it's pretty straightforward. You set up Nexus configuration in a given pom.xml file. Remember, the pom.xml file is a configuration file which is created, or which Maven uses to set up all its necessary configurations, all its necessary dependencies and plugins and all the like. If you come back to our project repository, this is our Maven project repository. You can always reference the previous video to know more about this repository. But basically, this repository contains our Java application code, and in the Java application code, we have a pom.xml file. This pom.xml file is what we are using to manage all the dependencies and all the libraries necessary for running our Maven project. So if you come to our pom.xml file, you see the properties of this pom.xml file is running on Java 1.8. You see more dependencies you see the dependencies which are actually being used. We have Spring Framework and Spring Boot Starter Web, And then if you come more detail, you now see distribution management, snapshot repository. This is where we are configuring our Nexus repository. So if you are to position or if you are to configure Nexus to make use of these given configurations, you would set up those configurations settings here in your pom.xml file for your Java project. And basically, it's all about you adding a given set of IPs corresponding to your Nexus repository. And of course, you also want to reference a given Nexus repository that was created in your Nexus Repository Manager. Now back to our repository, basically, like I explained, this is how you configure Nexus in your given pom.xml file, which is a file which will be used when you run the Maven deploy commands. Now this is another XML settings.xml file where you can further configure Nexus snapshots. The moment you've done these basic configurations and you run the Maven deploy Maven deploy will automatically run the deployment in a given environment. So this is the basic architecture of Maven and Nexus integration. We have the developers writing the code, committing the code to a given GitHub repository. Then we access those code through from our Maven server by cloning into our Maven server. And then after cloning, of course, we can run the various Maven commands like Maven validate, Maven compile, Maven test, Maven package, and Maven deploy. Alternatively, we can run Maven deploy, which by default will run all the subsequent commands. And after Maven deploy has created artifact, the artifact can be a WAR or a jar file. After Maven deploy has created this artifact, you can now deploy your artifact in your Nexus Repository Manager. Now, Maven deploy will automatically push these artifacts to be stored in your Nexus repository. So back into this configuration, we already did this in our previous video. We created our GitHub repository. We are going to be using the same Maven learning repo, and then we also set up Maven server, which we did in our previous module. You want to watch the previous video to understand how to set up Maven. And then the next step, or the step which we are going to be configuring, is just us using or setting up an instance, an EC2 instance, Amazon Linux 2 instance, to install Nexus on that given instance. And then once Nexus is installed, we are now going to move the necessary configurations as far as Nexus is concerned into our given project pom.xml file. And after that modification, we run Maven deploy and see our artifacts being stored in our Nexus repository, of course, in the snapshot repository. Now let's go ahead to set up a Nexus Repository Manager on an EC2 instance. Let's set up a Nexus Repository Manager on an EC2 instance on the AWS console. So I'm assuming you're logged in, so you need to log into your AWS console. We are going to be launching an EC2 instance and set up Nexus on this given EC2 instance. Now, for us to set up the configuration, I'll come back here in the Nexus Learning repository. I'm in the Nexus Learning repository. These are the installation. You come to the installation directory in this Nexus Learning repository. You open the installation directory and you will find this shell script, Nexus installation.sh. This is a shell script that you can use to install Nexus. So you can use this shell script to install Nexus. Now, when you come back to our EC2 console, we have our Maven server from the previous module, which was stopped. We are going to be starting this server in the next couple of minutes, but let's first launch our Nexus server. So for us to launch our Nexus server, I'll click on launch instances. Now I'll call this server Nexus Learning Server, and I'll choose Amazon Linux. So you can use the Amazon, we'll be using Amazon Linux instance to run this server on. Now you can leave the configurations as this for the AMI type. We can select for the instance type, you can use T2 medium. So you can use T2 medium. For us to have a server which is actually very fast, you can use T2 medium. And then for the key pair, you can select your given key pair. So I have a key pair in my environment, so I'll choose the key pair which I have, one that key pair. So you also want to choose a key pair. Now we are going to click on edit, where we'll be editing some settings with respect to our given Nexus repository. Now you can assuming you have a different VPC, you can use your VPC that has been customized, but I'll be using the default VPC that already has a public subnet. The requirement is for this VPC to have a public subnet. I could as well come in and automatically select the public subnet if I want to be more specific, but you need to set up your Nexus in a public subnet just for simplicity or for understanding in this module. And then you also want to enable auto assign public IP, where you publicly you want to give the possibility for this Nexus server to have a public IP on creation. Now when you enable public IP, the next thing is for us to have the right security groups. So we are going to give the security group name Nexus Learning SG to signify Nexus Learning Security Group. So Nexus Learning SG. So I'll copy all of these and I'll replace in the description. We have Nexus Learning SG. Now you allow the default port 22 port open because we are going to be we'll do an SSH into the given Nexus server, and we will need to add one additional port, which is the port for the Nexus Repository Manager. Nexus Repository Manager runs on port 8081. So we'll be adding a security group rule. You click on add security group rule. Now there's the first security group here. There's the first security group rule here. TCP 22 on allowed to anyone, well, source anywhere, IPv4. The same thing, we also have security group 2. We'll be adding a security group rule 2, and then we use custom TCP. Now the most important thing which you must take note of is we are adding the port 8081. For you to verify this, you can come to your new tab. You can ask Nexus Repository port. So you click on Nexus Repository port. Maybe I should have put Nexus Repository port number. Maybe I should put Nexus Repository port number. So if you select Nexus Repository port number, you see that once the repository manager is started, the application is listening on the configured IP address range and port. By default, any IP address and port 8081. So Nexus by default uses port 8081. So that's why in our security group here, we are insisting on port 8081 for the Nexus repository port. Now once you have your Nexus repository port configured here, you come to advanced details. Rather, you click on advanced details, you scroll down. When you scroll right down, you'll be required to put in a user data. And this user data is pretty straightforward. We come back to our Nexus Learning repository. This is the user data. If you're not sure, I'll come back to this data again. So if I'm in my Nexus Learning repository, once I'm in the Nexus Learning repo, I'll click on installations. Once I click installations, I'll now go to the Nexus installation.sh. Once I'm in the Nexus installation.sh, I'll just copy the raw file. You see, click here, you see copy raw file, and it shows copied. Once I copy the raw file, I'll come back to where I'm launching my EC2 instance, and I'll paste the configuration code. Again, this is the configuration code which you use to set up Nexus repository manager. Once you paste that, I'll go over this configuration again. Pretty straightforward. You start by giving the Nexus server a name, Nexus Learning Server, running on Amazon Linux 2023, and then the instance type t2.medium, using the right key pair which I have access to, and then using a public subnet in my default VPC. You might have another VPC which is also having a public subnet. You want to launch the Nexus server in a public subnet, and then you can come to security group. We created a new security group called Nexus Learning Security Group, and then we give that security group some configurations to have our first security group port 22, because we'll be able to SSH into the Nexus server, and then we also have port 8081 to be able to access the Nexus server on our console or on our web browser. And then of course the last configuration which we did, you click on advanced details, and you add the corresponding user data to install Nexus. This is the user data which we copied from our Nexus Learning repository over here. So once you have all of these, you click on, again, we are using just one instance. These are the instance details, AMI, the instance t2.medium, and then a new security group with this particular volume. Once you have all of these configurations, you click on launch instance. Oh, we did not select the source type, so let me select source type anywhere, and I click on launch instance. Now you see successfully initiated launch of instance IDs. So let me click on this to get to the instance that has been launched. So this is the instance ID. This Nexus Learning Nexus Learning server. You can see it's in the pending state, T2 medium. This is the public IP address of the server. This is the private IP address. And to know more details, you can see security, the IAM roles, the inbound rules is connected to port. The security group actually is the Nexus Learning security group which you created. And if you scroll down, you see the ports that are open. You see port 22 open and port 8081 open for the inbound rule. And then for the outbound rule, we have the default outbound rule. So if you let's refresh and see. If you refresh, we will see that our instance is initializing. So while it's initializing, I can just check out some other configurations like the networking. We see the public IP, the private IP. Again, the user data which we use for this given server, this is the user data, the Nexus installation.sh. So once you click on the Nexus installation.sh, it will give you this script, which we just copy this script and pass as a user data. Now coming back here, I think our instance should be up and running. I'll refresh again. Once we have the instance initializing, or you can copy the public IP, you open a new tab. Again, you come to the instance, you copy the instance public IP, you open a new tab, you paste that IP, you type colon on the keyboard, and you specify port 8081. So again, you see here, they say by default, Nexus uses any IP address and port 8081. So for our case, any IP address will correspond to the public IP of the Nexus server upon creation, and then port 8081. So once you have this configuration, you hit enter, and then it will take you to, you need to continue to site. So once you continue to site, it takes some time for your Nexus server to come up. We have it, Sonatype Nexus Repository. For you to have this running, you must have had a 2-on-2 check here. So if I refresh this, I'll see a 2-on-2 check, meaning that all the installation commands have been executed. So you see Sonatype Nexus Repository being configured or starting up to correspond to our Nexus server loading. So we have our Nexus server has been created and the Nexus server is loading. So let's set up our Nexus Repository Manager to be able to set up the necessary configurations for us storing artifacts in Nexus. Now, for us to get started, we have to log into or sign into our Nexus server, and to do that, you click on sign in. Once you click on sign in, we need to get the admin password for our Nexus server. For us to sign in, we need to get the admin password for our Nexus server. So you copy this link. Well, let's first open our terminal. If you're using a MacBook, you can open your terminal. So I'll open my terminal on MacBook. I'll open my terminal. Let me clear my screen. And then I'll go to the directory that has my given. Let me make it bigger. I'll go to the directory that has my given key pair. My key pair is currently in my desktop directory. So if I do an ls, you see my key pair. This is my key pair here. I have other key pairs. You see my key pair. Now, once you come to the directory that has your key pair, you can also check pwd, your present working directory. This is the directory in which I am. This is the directory in which I am, and this directory contains my key pair. So with this directory having your key pair, you come back to your AWS console. You select the Nexus server. If it's not highlighted, you select it here. You highlight the Nexus server here, and then you click on connect. Once you click on connect, you see configurations. You could connect with EC2 instance connect. You could connect with sessions manager if you've set up SSM on this instance, which we've not. You could connect with SSH client. So once you select SSH client, you can copy these two commands. You can copy the command gmod 400. You copy gmod 400 and you paste where you have your key pair. And then the second command, you copy SSH this, and then you select and you paste here in your console. You can do this on, if you're using MacBook, you can use your Mac terminal, or you're using Windows, you can use your Git Bash terminal. Now, once you have this, all you need to do is you take yes, and then you give us access into our Nexus server. So our Nexus server is running on Amazon Linux 2023. We now just need to get the administrative password for our Nexus server for us to be able to log in the first time. So for us to do that, we come back to our Nexus. This is our Nexus. You highlight this, you copy this. Remember, we got this. When you click on sign in, you will be required to get this password. So I'll copy this. Once I copy. Once I come back to my Nexus server, I'll type the command sudo cat, and then I'll paste the link. So again, I copy this link from our Nexus repository. I come to my Nexus server and I do sudo cat and I paste the link. Once you do this, you hit enter, and now it will give you the default password for your Nexus repository manager. It gives you the default password for your Nexus repository manager, and that default password, it starts here right up to this point, or you can start here and copy right up to this point. This will be your own. You can, once you hit the command, you have your own password. So you can copy the password, you highlight the password and you copy, and then for the login, you give the username admin, and for the password, you paste the password. You give the username admin and you paste this password. Again, this password is collected once we do the sudo cat opt Nexus work, and we get the Nexus admin password. So once you get the Nexus admin password, you click on sign in, and it should take you to your Nexus server. Now we need to complete these setup steps. So they say this wizard will help you complete required setup tasks. So you take next. For the password, just give admin, since we don't want to have issues with passwords. So just give the password. The new password should be admin, lowercase. They must match both for the new and the old password. So they must match both for in both cases where you need to confirm. Now once you do that, you take next. And when you select next, we don't want anyone to anonymously access our Nexus server. That's why we are going to select disable anonymous access. We'll select disable anonymous access, ensuring that no random individual will have access to our Nexus server. Once you disable anonymous access, you take next. And then once you take next, the setup tasks have been completed. Enjoy using Nexus Repository Manager. Enjoy using Nexus Repository Manager. Once you configure that, the last thing, you click on finish. And when you finish, this is what the Nexus dashboard looks like. Welcome, usage, 100,000 threshold, last 24 unique logins, no logins, and stuff. So you can have the summary of all your given artifacts here. You can browse based on different projects. You have browse assets and components. We have Maven Central, Maven Public, Java releases, Java snapshots, Nugget groups, Nugget hosted, Nugget.org proxy. These are the different repositories that have been created. These are different uploads into the server. You come to settings if you want to create your own repository, and under settings you see repositories. You can have repositories here. You click on repositories. These are existing repositories which are in the Nexus server by default. These are existing Nexus repository on the Nexus server by default. So we are going to create our own repository in the project, and we are going to call this repository. Well, we are creating this repository for Maven, so we can select Maven group. We call this repository. We give the name Java web app repository. We give the name Java web app repository. Now the version policy, we don't want to allow just release. This means we want to be able to store. They are asking what type of artifacts do these repositories store. We don't want to store just releases. We want to store both releases and snapshots. So we'll select mixed. And then when you come down here, member repositories, you can enable for us to store releases. You can enable for us to store snapshots. You can enable for us to store Maven Central, as well as you can enable for us to store Maven Public. So these are the basic steps. First, you give the name Java Web App Repository. You enable the version policy to mixed, and then you later on move all the available member repositories into these members. Once you've put these basic configurations, you click on create repository. And when you click on create repository, you will now see the repository Java web app repo running on our Nexus server. This is repository URL 18.this.dev slash 8081 slash repository slash Java. So basically what this means is if you open this link in a new tab, you should be able to access this given repository. So you see the Java web app repository. This Maven 2 group repository is not directly browsable in this URL. Please, well, this basically gives you access to this given repository. Now, for us to do further configurations, let's go ahead to, well, let me save this. For us to do further configurations, let's go ahead to start our Maven server. So I'll come back to my EC2 dashboard, and then I'll start the Maven server from the previous exercise. If you don't have a Maven server, you can come back to this learning repository. You look at the Maven install steps. This is a README file containing all the steps which you can set up Maven in a given on a given EC2 instance. So you get the installation steps here, and then you spin up a Maven server if you do not have a Maven server. Now, based on this configuration, I'll come back here. I already have a Maven server from the previous lesson, so I'll search for Maven. You see I have the Maven server. The Maven server is stopped because on the previous exercise we stopped the server. So all I need to do is to select the server, and then I come to instance state, and I click on start instance. Once you refresh, you have the instance public IP and the private IP. So let's go ahead to connect. You can connect to the instance, but before connecting to the instance, remember from the previous module, if you come back to my repo, DevOps with my repo, you come to repositories. We created a practice Maven learning. This is a practice Maven learning repository which we created. If you come to our VS Code, this is the repository. We cloned the original Maven learning repository, and then now we clone this. We created our own repository, practice Maven learning repository in our local, and we updated it in our Maven learning folder. So with these configurations, we actually had our Maven server created. We can connect to our Maven server. So let me go to EC2 instance connect. Let me go to EC2 instance connect. I'll copy this. We no longer need the session with our Nexus server. We've already gotten the admin. So I'll exit this. The session is already closed. Let me clear. This is a setup configuration for the Maven server. So I'll take yes, and then I should log into the Maven server. For us to confirm, once it's logged in, you can do an ls. If you do an ls, you see practice Maven learning. Remember, we cloned this. Let me see if we still have history of all our commands which we did previously. This is the set of commands which we executed in our Maven server. We just did a clone. We did a git clone to get the Maven learning server from the respective repository. We seeded into it, sudo yum install tree, and all of that. So if you don't have the instance, you set up the instance, and then you access the necessary instance configuration here in our practice Maven learning repo. Once you have access to your server, if you run Maven deploy, you run all the previous commands. So previous build, failure, scanning for projects, memory disk. You specified, oh, we are not in the necessary directory. So let me cd to our practice Maven. I'll clear. If I do pwd, I'm in the home EC2 user practice Maven learning. I'll cd to Java, where we have our application code. If I do an ls, I'll see the src folder, as well as if I do a tree, we install tree in our Maven server. If I do a tree, I will see the necessary configuration, the source, the main, and stuff. So with this, I'll run the Maven deploy in our current directory, which is the directory content. So let me do a pwd. You see we are currently in the home EC2 user practice Maven learning Java code. Now, while we're in this directory, we'll do a Maven deploy. So it's running the build. It shouldn't take long because we already did the necessary builds from our previous exercise. So it runs all the respective Maven commands, the test, validate, package, verify, all the necessary Maven commands. It runs in this given Maven deploy step. So once you run Maven's deploy, you see it's trying to deploy to a given Nexus repository on 172.31.19.50.80.81 repository on the Java Web App repository. But we do not have this repository configured, and it is looking for this repository in the home ec2 user.m2 Nexus repository and all the like. So the configuration which we are going to be doing in our next video is for us to set up the configurations for Nexus. We are going to be establishing connectivity between our Maven server and our Nexus repository. Now we've just created our Nexus repository. We need to establish the connectivity between our Nexus server, between our Nexus repository basically, and our Maven server. So for us to do that, let's begin by creating a repository on Nexus. So once you're on Nexus, you click on repositories here. You can come here to repositories. You click on create repository. And when you click on create repository, you click on create. Now you select Maven 2 hosted. You select Maven 2 hosted, and then you give the repository the name Java Web App Repository. You give the repository the name Java Web App Repository. They ask what type of artifacts does this repository store. This repository will store both release and snapshots. So we are going to be storing both release and snapshots. So we'll take mixed to indicate that we'll be storing both release and snapshots. Once you select mixed, it's just basic. Remember Java Web App Repository, and then you'll be storing mix, both release and snapshots. Once you select that, you click on create repository. Now once you've created a repository, that is the first step. The second step, we need to come to our VS Code. We need to modify our pom.xml file to match the necessary configurations of our given Nexus server. Now, the pom.xml file, for you to modify those configurations, once you open this pom.xml file, the file on line 64 and on line 69 has the configurations where you specify the given Nexus server. So for us to configure where we can verify the given Nexus server, we go back to our EC2 console. We come to our EC2 console. You select the private IP address. You copy the private IP address of the Nexus learning server. Once you collect the private IP address, you come back to your pom.xml file. Remember, this pom.xml file is under the practice Maven learning project we've been working on. You come to line 64 of your pom.xml file. You highlight this IP and you replace with the IP of your Nexus server. Now, why are we doing this? You remember, if you come to this documentation, we saw that Nexus runs on port 8081 of any IP address. So you see, by default, any IP address and port 8081 are used. So in a pom.xml file, this is the IP address of our Nexus server, and then this is port 8081. This is the IP address of our Nexus server, and then port 8081. Take note, it is the private IP, not the public IP. It is the private IP of our Nexus server. Now, once you have this private IP of your Nexus server, you replace it in line 64 and you replace it in line 68. You replace it in line 68. You do the same thing. You come to your setting.xml file. You replace in line 64. You paste. You come to your setting.xml file. You do the same modifications. You come to line 63. These are setting.xml file. You come to line 63. You paste. And then you come to line 74 and you equally paste. You come to line 74 and you equally paste. Now for the section concerning SonarQube, we are going to be configuring this section in a bit. This section concerning or containing some configuration with respect to SonarQube. We'll be configuring this section in a bit. Now, once you have this basic configuration, you should see modified in your setting.xml file, as well as you see modified. Once you've done these configurations, you should see modified in your setting.xml file, as well as in your pom.xml file, you should see modified. With these given modifications, what we need to do is for us to push the code to our GitHub repository. Remember, you'll be pushing it to the GitHub repository, which is the practice Maven learning repo, which is a repository that contains our code base and is a repository which we use to set up our Maven server. Now, while you're in this path, you want to do a git status. If you do a git status, you'll see that we have modified our pom.xml file, as well as we have modified our setting.xml file. And the modification was basically us adding the necessary Nexus IP configurations in our pom.xml file and in our setting.xml file. Now, once we've done that, we can do the necessary git commands. It says we should do a git add, so we do git add and then dot git add dot. We should have added these two files into the staging area for us to commit to. If we do git status again, you'll see that there's modified Java web app and Java application code. Once you have that modification, you need now to do git commit -m. We can say modified pom.xml file and modified settings.xml, and then you end with the inverted comma. So that is what your commit message should look like. Modified git commit -m, modified pom.xml and setting.xml. Once you hit enter, you see that we have 2 files changed, 2 insertions and 2 deletions. With those necessary configurations, when you're sure that your files have been added, 2 insertions and 2 deletions, you can clear, and then we do a git push. Once you do git push, it will tell you enumerating, and then the files have been pushed to the repository upstream. Once both files have been modified, you come back to your Maven server, and the most important thing we are doing back in our Maven server is for us to pull the new changes which has happened in our repository. So you cd into the practice, while in the Maven server, you cd into the practice Maven learning. If you do pwd, you will see you're currently in the home easy to user practice Maven learning. Once you're in the practice Maven learning, you now do a git pull for us to get the new configuration changes. If you do a git pull, you'll see 2 files changed, 2 insertions and 2 deletions. Once you have these configurations, 2 files, 2 insertions and 2 deletions, we now need to move this settings.xml file into the we're moving the settings.xml file into the .m2 directory, which is what is being used by Maven for security and authentication and all the like. So we need to move this setting.xml file to the .m2 file containing the most recent updates with respect to our Nexus servers. So for us to do that, let me cd back to our home directory. If I do pwd, you see I'm in the home EC2 user. Once you're in the home EC2 user, you do an ls for the .m2. For the .m2, you see there is already an existing setting.xml file which is used by default by Maven. So our responsibility is to replace this setting.xml file in this .m2 directory with the new setting.xml file which we just cloned. And for us to do that, we cd back to our practice Maven. We do an ls again. You see we have a setting.xml file here. So for us to move this file to our .m2 directory, we have mv, and then we specify the file which is the settings.xml file, and then we specify the directory which we are trying to move it to, which is .m2 directory, and we hit enter. So once we do that, we have successfully moved the settings.xml file containing all the security settings from our practice Maven learning to our .m2 learning. So if you do an ls, you will see there's no longer any settings.xml file here. Now, the next and the most important thing is for us to cd to the Java project, and I'll now run the Maven deploy. Remember, previously we had a failure because we were not having connectivity with our Nexus server. So the tellers could not find artifacts Failed to default. Java failed to deploy artifacts. Could not find artifacts. Java this build error. This in Nexus repository. So they say we could not find an artifact. We could not find an artifact jar this in Nexus deployment repo. Let's delete the repository and try to create again. Let's delete this repository and try to create again. So I'll click on this repository. I'll delete the repository. Yes. And then let's create a repository again. So I'll click on create repository. I'll select Maven. I'll select Maven to hosted. And I'll give the name Java Web App Repository. Once I give the name Java Web App Repository, I'll select the type as mixed. Java Web App Repository, I'll select the type as mixed because we want to store both releases and new. Because we want to store both releases and snapshots. Once I select that, I'll click on create repository. Once I create this new repository, let's run a Maven deploy again. So I'll clear. And then we run a Maven deploy. So you see scanning project, building Java snapshot, that test, and then it's running the deploy. Maven test failures, that progress, that. Now the deploy was successful. We see the build is successful. Now you see uploading to Nexus deployment repo on this IP, and then uploaded to Nexus deployment repo. This is on this IP. For you to verify that your artifact has been created and deployed, we come back to our Nexus server. We click here to browse server contents. We click there to browse server contents. We come to browse. We click on browse. You come to the Java Web App Repository, and you should now see content with respect to this repository. You see content with respect to this repository. If you click on snapshot, you see one snapshot has been created. This one snapshot is because we've been able to run the build just once. For us to go a step further, we come back to our Maven server. We rerun the Maven deploy, meaning that we are trying to, assuming that we have created some new form of code, we are trying to push the code again to consider or to take into consideration or to take into account the new fixes or the new changes. Now, once you do a new deploy, you see a new snapshot is created. And for us to verify that a new snapshot is created, you can come back here. If you refresh this tab, you see Maven. If you refresh this tab, you go to browse, you come to your Java project, you come to snapshot, you will now see we have the second snapshot. So for as long as you're doing a new build, a new snapshot is being created. So it automatically, if you are to do if you cd to a Java project, you do a tree. If you do a tree, you come here, you see we have this Java Web App 1.0.jar snapshot which was created, and then this is another Java 1.0.jar snapshot which was created. So these are the various snapshots. For every time you do a build, a new snapshot is created, which is then pushed to your Nexus repository. So basically, this is how Maven works with Nexus, where you use Maven to create your artifacts, your jar artifacts as snapshots, and then you store those artifacts here in Nexus. If you open this, you will now see the corresponding jar file. So we have the Java Web App 1.0 done on this date.jar. The same thing, if you open the second one, you will see Java Web App 1.0/0.2. So that's basically how we can configure Nexus and Maven. Let's go on to our next modules to configure SonarQube.